If I am a star, the people made me a star.
Marilyn Monroe.
Life is stayed here and now. Fame is fickle.
Marilyn Monroe.
I give you the two most exciting words in the modern dictionary. Marilyn Monroe!
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to this episode of All Things Marilyn. This is Scott Fortner, Marilyn Monroe historian, collector, and owner of the Marilyn Monroe collection.
And I'm Elisa Jordan. I'm the founder of LA Woman Tours, an author, and I am also a Marilyn historian.
How's it going, Elisa?
It's good. How have you been?
Pretty good. Long time no see, long time no listen, long time no hear. It's been a couple of weeks since we were able to tape a new episode of All Things Marilyn. You've been out of town and I've been hosting company, so here we are.
Yep, that's right. I went to go visit my brother in Oregon, and it was a lot of fun.
Welcome back.
How was your company?
It was good. It's good. Good times, good friends, good fun. Always good when they leave. So we're here today to talk about something very exciting. Last we met, we interviewed April Vivier, author of A Day in the Life, a calendar of events and activities throughout Marilyn's entire adult life. And we were also talking with her about the research that she had been working on in relation to Marilyn and Marilyn's relationship with Ella Fitzgerald. April had uncovered that the story around Marilyn getting Ella booked at the Macombo isn't actually quite what happened. And as part of her research, she referenced a document that had come from Marilyn's files. As part of our conversation with April, I was able to announce that something very exciting was coming up, something that was going to rewrite history, something very important in Marilyn Monroe's life. And that has just surfaced in the news. It was something that I found in the files as I was archiving Marilyn's final documents and paperwork that she had maintained. And as reported in the news, it is a greeting card from Stanley Gifford, Marilyn Monroe's now proven to be biological father.
There's been a lot of controversy over the years as to who Marilyn Monroe's biological father is. Some people say it's unknown. No one knew who it was, or Gladys didn't know who it was, or that it was Gladys's husband at the time, Edward Mortensen. So we really now have the proof. So this is all new information coming out within the last year that we finally have confirmation that Charles Stanley Gifford, who went by Stan, is Marilyn's biological father. We now have proof that he at one point reached out to her.
And that's huge.
It's major.
There's been no evidence whatsoever that there was any actual contact between Marilyn and her father. For our episode today, we're going to start at the very beginning, Marilyn's childhood, and then go all the way up through the point in time when I actually discovered the greeting card in Marilyn Monroe's archives. Let's talk about Marilyn's childhood and the fact that when she was much younger, she actually never even knew who her father was. And she fantasized about whom being her father.
She fantasized about Clark Gable being her father. And that's why if you study Marilyn Monroe, there are a couple of figures from her childhood that she really fixated on. We've already addressed one, and that was Jean Harlow. The other was Clark Gable. That's because Gladys had a photo of the man she said was your father. He had that pencil mustache that was really popular in the 20s and 30s. Clark Gable had that too. So she fixated on that and began to pretend that Clark Gable was her father, and that affectionate feeling she had for him, she maintained that for the rest of her life. It's really cute if you think about it. She had a couple of meetings with Clark Gable at different points. He came to a party that was thrown for her. He sent her flowers. He and his wife sent her flowers when she was in the hospital once. And of course, they starred in a movie together. And they just had a very nice, warm relationship. One day we'll do a Clark Gable episode because there's some controversy. Some people think Marilyn was responsible for his death, which is not true, by the way. I'll just say that right now. She adored Clark Gable and had very warm feelings for him.
I found it really touching that she idolized him so much as a young girl, and then they ended up starring in a film together. And it was actually their final film for both of them, her final completed film, and of course his final film. He passed away not long after production ended.
It's this weird poetic ending for both of them, or at least in her story. And he was called the King of Hollywood during his lifetime even. So he got to hear that nickname. And Marilyn is basically the Queen of Hollywood. So I think of them as the king and queen of Hollywood. Because I'm a Marilyn fan, I just love the fact that she grew up to be the queen to his king.
You know, something else that's really fascinating, and this is a part of my collection, is this booklet of cigarette cards that Marilyn had as a young girl. And she collected all of the cards, and they were cards of film stars from when she was a young girl. In our episode about Jean Harlow, I mentioned that Jean Harlow was one of the cards. One of the other cards was Clark Gable.
Of course, she had the Clark Gable one.
Imagine what it must have been like for her to grow up and become famous and get a chance to actually meet and then ultimately one day work with Clark Gable, her male idol, whereas Jean Harlow was her female idol.
There are some pictures of them on the Misfits set, and they are some of my favorite pictures of Marilyn because she is looking at Clark Gable in awe.
Right.
And you can just see it on her face how happy she is. I'm happy that she had that experience because you can see on her face how much it meant to her.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I was going to mention it too. Looking at the photos of them together on the Misfits, you can just really see there was a special bond. I also think that she had a pretty special bond with Monty Clift. You could tell in photos.
Oh, absolutely.
She really loved him, and I think he really loved her as well.
That was more of a brother-sister bond, I think.
Agreed. Now we'll pivot a bit to how we know for sure that Stanley Gifford actually was Marilyn Monroe's biological father. Earlier this year, there was a new documentary that was released, and it's called Marilyn, Her Final Secret, filmed by a French documentary crew who set out to verify who Marilyn Monroe's biological father actually was via DNA testing. They reached out to a couple of different individuals to try to get actual examples of Marilyn Monroe's hair. And one of those people that they contacted was John Resnikoff, who is known as an authenticator of hair. I don't exactly know how you authenticate somebody's hair. I'm sure there might be some type of a science or data behind that. I don't understand it myself. I'm not really quite sure how you can authenticate somebody's hair as being from the person who someone says the hair is from. And of course, if we harken back to May of this year and the issue of the Marilyn Monroe hair that was gifted to Kim Kardashian as part of her wearing the Happy Birthday, Mr. President dress to the Met Gala. The hair that was gifted to Kim actually couldn't have been authentic because it was attributed to Robert Champion, who, for whatever reason, hair from his personal collection has been attributed to having been cut from Marilyn Monroe's head the night of the JFK Gala. But Robert Champion did not cut or style Marilyn Monroe's hair the evening of May 19th, 1962 for the JFK Gala. It was actually Mr. Kenneth, and everyone knows that now. There's a document also pulled from Marilyn's personal files, an invoice from Mr. Kenneth. It verifies that he cut her hair May 18th and 19th, 1962. And of course, the date of the JFK Gala was May 19th, 1962. So there's no way that she would have had her hair cut and styled again by somebody else for that gala. Very interesting point of note, even Robert Champion doesn't say that he cut and styled Marilyn Monroe's hair the night of the JFK Gala. He was there on behalf of Maria Callas. He cut and styled her hair. There are photos of Champion with Maria Callas and Marilyn Monroe, but again, even he doesn't say that he did Marilyn's hair. He says he touched up her makeup, but I find that a little bit questionable too, because Marilyn had her makeup already done before coming to the gala. This film crew reaches out to John Resnikoff. They acquire 8 strands of Marilyn Monroe's hair, 5 of which are from Robert Champion, and 3 of which are from Alan Abbott. And who was Alan Abbott for our listeners?
Alan Abbott was someone who worked at the funeral home or the mortuary where Marilyn's body was being prepared. Her neck was damaged during the autopsy process. They had to fix the laxity of her skin and her face. They heightened the back of her neck or head to make her look better. And during the process of that, they clipped some hair. He took the hair out of the trash can. That is how we have a confirmed sample of Marilyn's hair. Now, I will say that there are other samples of Marilyn's hair. We know that a lock of hair was sold a couple of years ago at auction through Julian's, and that is also an authentic clipping. It was from Marilyn's hairdresser in New York, and that was taken by a woman named Frida, who was part of the Monroe Six. The Monroe Six was a group of 6 fans that followed Marilyn everywhere. They were not intrusive, and she liked them. Frida asked if she could have a clipping of Marilyn's hair. Marilyn did say, yes, you can have some. Just go ask my hairstylist the next time he cuts my hair.
I think what might be a little bit controversial here is the fact that it was taken from Marilyn after she had passed away. But they needed to cut hair in order to gather her neck and make her presentable for her funeral. After everyone had gone home, from what I understand, he was the only one that was there, and he took the hair out of the trash can, along with a pair of falsies.
Falsies. Yeah. So the story goes, and we can confirm it because we have the falsies. Marilyn's half sister, Bernice, was the one who was helping staff dress Marilyn. The funeral arrangements were made by Joe DiMaggio and Bernice. Usually, when you hear about the funeral, it's just Joe DiMaggio making the arrangements. It was actually Joe and Bernice working together. And of course, Bernice, being Marilyn's sister and being the woman, handled Marilyn's wardrobe. She went to Marilyn's house, picked out a nice dress and a wig and falsies, and brought them to the mortuary for Marilyn to be dressed. The wig was because they needed her to look presentable during a viewing. When they were dressing Marilyn, the woman who worked at the mortuary put the falsies in, and they just didn't look right. During an autopsy, we have that Y incision across the chest. Again, Marilyn's body was damaged during that procedure. So the falsies just didn't look correct anymore. They just didn't fit Marilyn's body the way they had in life. So the woman took the falsies out and she said, that doesn't look like Marilyn Monroe. And she took stuffing and stuffed Marilyn's bra and said, that looks like Marilyn Monroe. And you know what? It's an act of kindness. You hear sometimes people talk about when you're preparing someone for a funeral, it is the last act of kindness you show them before they are laid to rest. And that's how I see what this woman did. She wanted Marilyn Monroe to look like Marilyn Monroe. The falsies were thrown away, and Alan Abbott dug them out of the trash.
I agree with what you're saying, Elisa. I think it really is the duty of a funeral home to try to present the deceased in the most realistic way, so that when people are coming to the funeral and viewing the body, of course, they want to see their loved one in the way that they looked when they were alive, of course. That's why they needed to do that to Marilyn's neck.
Yeah.
Her body was a bit needing some special attention, if you will. Back to the story of the hair.
That's how we get the hair.
So to reconfirm, the film documentary crew reached out to John Resnikoff, acquired 8 strands of hair, 5 that were attributed to Robert Champion, who says the hair came from times that he would cut Marilyn Monroe's hair. And of course, for whatever reason, some people are attributing it to him having cut her hair at the President Kennedy birthday gala, May of 1962. 3 strands of hair came from Alan Abbott, who, as we just mentioned, gathered the hair from the trash can after Marilyn's body had been prepared for her funeral service.
The hair sourced from Robert Champion, which is said to have been taken from Marilyn's head the night of the JFK gala, yielded no results.
Hair tested from Alan Abbott actually proved to be a match. Therefore, we have DNA testing that verifies Stanley Gifford is indeed Marilyn Monroe's father.
At long last, we know.
At long last. And the interesting thing is, to me, it's not a big surprise. You can really see the resemblance. Marilyn looks very much like Stanley Gifford.
She looks like a perfect combination of her mother Gladys and Stan Gifford. One of the things that I like about this story is Gladys, because she was a flapper type figure in the 1920s, and then because she later struggled with mental illness, people love to portray her negatively. And they will talk about no one really knows who Marilyn's father was because Gladys was sleeping around, and Gladys never wavered. She always said, Stan Gifford is the father of my baby. She told Marilyn, Stan Gifford is your father. Marilyn believed Stan Gifford was her father. Marilyn never wavered. And so I feel like Gladys has been the victim of a lot of misogyny, of judgment, because she did have mental illness. And it makes a better story, frankly, if we don't know who Marilyn's father is. It sells more books, it sells more magazines, it makes Marilyn's story more tragic. But Gladys and Marilyn never wavered. They always said Stan Gifford was the father. And I feel like this is kind of a victory for them. And Stan Gifford's granddaughter, Francine, she has said that the rumor was always in the family because Marilyn talked about it publicly, which she did. Her father, who was Stan Gifford's son, that would make him Marilyn's half brother, really did not want to address this during his lifetime. I don't think he wanted to address the fact that his father was one of the world's most famous deadbeat dads. That would be embarrassing. I'm kind of guessing, but there was something in the family that didn't want to address it.
Francine actually says that she was aware of the fact that Marilyn went to Hemet more than once to try to meet her grandfather, Stanley Gifford, but he just refused to see her. And it was known in the family.
Yeah, Marilyn talked about it publicly.
Let's talk a little bit about Stanley Gifford and his relationship with Gladys. He was actually Gladys's boss.
He was at Consolidated Films, which is where Gladys worked as a film cutter. That's kind of old school movie making, but she was literally slicing and cutting movies that would be shipped out to theaters. They met in the 1920s. He was newly divorced from a woman named Lillian. He had two small children, a daughter and a son, Stan Gifford Jr. Now, this is where it gets a little confusing, but it's important to remember this. Stan was newly divorced. Gladys and her husband were newly separated. I make that distinction because they were still legally married, but no longer a couple. She begins dating Stan around Christmas time, 1925. She informs Stan that she's expecting a child. And according to Gladys, he never denied being the father. What he told her was, it's a good thing you're already married. And by that, he meant you could put your husband's name on the birth certificate. The reason for this is because in 1925, it would have been a little taboo to have an illegitimate child. It was not generally accepted, and it would have been a scandal.
And that's what she did.
That's what she did. He didn't want his name on the birth certificate. He made it very clear that he wanted nothing to do with the child. So that's why when you look at Marilyn's birth certificate, it has Edward Mortensen's name on it. In her early life, she was Norma Jeane Mortensen, never Norma Jeane Gifford.
Gladys definitely had the idea to protect herself as well.
Oh, yeah. She was still a single mother because her husband wasn't around. The divorce eventually was finalized, and she wasn't in a place to care for a child by herself, which is why she placed Marilyn with neighbors of her mother. So by her mother, I mean Gladys's mother had neighbors across the street who regularly took in foster children. So that's how Marilyn ended up in foster care. Marilyn did go by Norma Jeane Mortensen. It later changed to Norma Jeane Baker because that was Gladys's first husband's name. And this gets confusing too. Stay with me. Gladys had two children by her first husband, Jasper Baker, and he had taken the children to Kentucky. She was unable to regain custody, but it was her dream, as it would be for any mother, to get her two oldest children back. And when she got them back, she wanted all of her children to have the same last name. So she started calling Norma Jeane at one point, Norma Jeane Baker. So all three children would have the same last name. So that's why she goes from Mortensen to Baker, but her legal name was still Mortensen. So on her first marriage certificate, she's Norma Jeane Mortensen, but never Gifford. Her legal father was the ex-husband.
What's really interesting is way back when, it's a lot easier to make those types of changes. There were no online records like we have now. You can't just go change a child's name easily.
There weren't even social security cards yet.
Right. Totally different world. Totally different world. Lots of history with Marilyn and her father.
That's how we get Marilyn as a fatherless child. And she will talk about being unwanted. And she certainly was by her father. How upsetting would it be to know that your mother informs your father, you're on the way, and he says, I'm out of here. Put another man's name on the birth certificate because I'm not going to take care of this kid.
But somewhere that changed, because we have this greeting card that I found in Marilyn Monroe's archives. Let's switch gears and talk about Marilyn Monroe's archives and the history there and the importance of the archives. We save things that are important to us, or we save certain documents or certain records or things that we think we may need for the future. Interestingly about Marilyn, she saved everything. And we know for a fact that there were at least two filing cabinets that were full of all types of correspondence, documents, invoices, files, receipts, letters, contracts, business documentation, you name it. An incredible array of information that really, as we mentioned in our last interview with April, helps us know so much more about Marilyn than we may be able to learn or know about some other celebrities who perhaps didn't keep such great records. It's really an interesting journey, though, these filing cabinets, because there's been quite a bit of mystery around the cabinets. And basically, she had 2 filing cabinets. There may have been 3. So I need to clarify that there may have actually been 3 filing cabinets. Some people firmly believe that there were 3. We know for sure, though, that there were 2. There was a gray cabinet and there was a brown cabinet. The gray filing cabinet, Marilyn kept at her home, 12305 Fifth Helena Drive. The brown filing cabinet, which I'm actually the proud owner of today, I bought it at auction in 2016. That filing cabinet is the one that Marilyn kept in her dressing room at 20th Century Fox. After Marilyn Monroe passed away, there was an auction that was held, a public auction. Many of the items from Marilyn's home, including these 2 filing cabinets, were sold at the auction. Inez Melson, who was Marilyn Monroe's business manager, bought both of the filing cabinets and kept both of them. Interestingly, she bought one of the filing cabinets under a false name. She listed a relative's name as being the person who bought the cabinets, when in fact it was actually her who purchased the filing cabinets. So Inez Melson purchases Marilyn's 2 filing cabinets and all of their contents for whatever reason unknown. And again, this is just one of the most immense historical archives of information. And when I say that there's anything that you could think of, literally, there's everything. There are pharmacy receipts. There are letters from fans. There are photographs of Marilyn that she saved. There are telegrams. Everything about Marilyn and her personal life and her professional life are maintained in these 2 filing cabinets. After Inez Melson passes away, she wills the 2 filing cabinets to her sister, Ruth Conroy. Ruth Conroy had a son named Millington Conroy. So Mill, who I've met personally, acquired the 2 filing cabinets. Mill reached out to Mark Anderson and Lois Banner, a photographer and an author, and talked with them about writing a book about the contents of the filing cabinets. The book was published and it's called MM Personal. It was 2012. It's a fascinating book. You get a chance to look inside and see many of the documents that were maintained in the filing cabinets. Mark Anderson was brilliant in the way that he photographed all of the documents. He's got roses and other types of flowers and beautiful lighting, and it really is a great book. I actually helped Lois and Mark on the project, and I know both of them personally, and it was a really fun project. With the launch of the book, the Strasberg family became aware of the filing cabinets, and then there arose an issue of who actually owned the filing cabinets. Long story short, after Marilyn passed away, Lee Strasberg, who I should mention here, didn't even know that he was mentioned in Marilyn's will. It wasn't until after she died that he realized he was going to be getting all of her personal effects. An inventory was presented to Lee Strasberg about the items that were in Marilyn Monroe's house in her possession when she passed away. Excluded from the inventory were the 2 filing cabinets. So they were put up for auction, and Inez Melson bought both of the filing cabinets, and one of them under a false name. Lee wasn't aware that the cabinets had even existed and therefore didn't give permission for the filing cabinets to be sold. When the Strasberg family came to realize that there were these 2 filing cabinets, there was an issue of who actually owned the filing cabinets. So, as these types of things normally do, they headed to a legal proceeding, and it was determined that the filing cabinets actually were the property of Lee Strasberg and his heirs. He hadn't given permission for them to be sold. Ownership of the filing cabinets and all of their contents transferred from Mill Conroy to the Strasberg family. They held them in storage for several years and then decided it was time to release those items. And so for the last several years, I've been working with Julian's going through and archiving the documents that are still in the filing cabinets and preparing them to be sold at auction. So over the last several years, if you go to Julian's auctions, you'll see many of the documents that are in the files going out and being made available to other collectors. As part of my research and archiving and going through personal files and documents, I discovered this card from Stanley Gifford.
So what was your reaction when you saw it?
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Did your heart just stop?
Yeah. You're like, this is big. This is going to change history. Because as we mentioned all along, Marilyn knew who her father was the whole time, but yet there's all these rumors, and it's never been confirmed that he was actually her father, even though her mother said, this is who your father is. There was never any definitive proof until the DNA test came out, but there was also never any proof that there was any contact. All we knew was that Marilyn called a couple of times. She drove to him looking for him, and he always said, I don't want anything to do with you. One time he even actually said to her when she did get in touch with him on the phone, call my attorney. And that was the extent of the conversation.
Yeah.
Very sad.
Very sad. Could you imagine wanting to know one of your parents your whole life and you reach out and you're completely rejected? The heartbreak that would be.
Well, it was just something else that led to, I think, some of the depression and sadness that Marilyn experienced. And we know, of course, that she dealt with a lot of those issues throughout her life.
Yeah.
He was a father figure.
Yeah, she wanted that.
And of course, we know that she called her husband's daddy. Right. And both of her husbands, well, I don't really count Jimmy because that was more of an arranged marriage than anything. But when you look at Joe DiMaggio and Arthur Miller, they're both older men. And she did call both of them daddy. So I think, there was something that was happening there mentally, psychologically, and emotionally for her.
Yeah. At the end of Marilyn's life, which we didn't know it was the end of Marilyn's life at the time, he did reach out to her and she did not apparently respond, or at the very least did not open the door for a relationship. So she had very clearly changed her mind.
Indeed. Well, let's talk about the card a little bit.
Okay.
It's a greeting card and it's a get well card. And it's very much a 1950s looking card, but it's a little girl standing on a music note and it says a cheery get well note. And the inside, dear Marilyn, here's something really fascinating. He spelled Marilyn's name wrong.
How do you spell Marilyn Monroe's name wrong? It's not like it's a secret how you spell Marilyn anyway, but Marilyn Monroe's name is everywhere.
Right. His own daughter's name, he spelled wrong. He spelled it Marylyn. And of course, it's Marilyn.
Yeah.
Dear Marilyn, this cheery little get well note comes to say that lots of thoughts and wishes too are with you every day. And he's underlined are with you every day. And he wrote in his own handwriting, a little prayer too. Stanley Gifford, Red Rock Dairy Farm, Hemet, California. This is very much a 1950s looking card, as I mentioned. I think you can tell kind of the era of greeting cards just by the way that they're designed and the way that they look. This is not a 1960s style of card. It's 1950s. I actually think that it's a card from a personal visit that he made to visit Marilyn when she was in the hospital. In her book, My Sister Marilyn, Bernice Miracle shares a story where Marilyn shared with her during one of their visits that Stanley Gifford actually had come to see Marilyn during one of her hospitalizations. So that appears to be probably the only time in person that they actually met. So if you think about Marilyn and her hospitalizations, she was usually in the hospital either in New York or LA. Gifford lived in Hemet, California. Chances are he didn't go all the way to New York to visit Marilyn. Chances are he visited her in an LA hospital. I would assume that because this is a 1950s era card, it was probably 1954 when he went to visit her when she was in the hospital in November of 1954, and probably hand delivered the card to her.
We should say that Marilyn was hospitalized a few times. And that's why we can't say definitively.
That's just my best guess as to when it could have been. It very possibly could have been hand delivered, and that may be the only time that they ever met.
So you mentioned you think it's hand delivered. Is there an envelope with it? So there's no postmark or anything?
There's no postmark. There's no envelope with the card, which is interesting because a lot of the other documents in Marilyn's files, the envelopes are actually there. And in this case, there's no envelope with the card.
She did save it, though.
She saved it. She saved everything. The smallest piece of paper with a handwritten note on it, $1 tip for this or that. There were thousands upon thousands of documents in those files. It's really an incredible archive. And you just really get to see so many different pieces of her history and her story just by looking at those documents.
So let's talk about she tries and tries and tries to establish a relationship, and she does not build a relationship with him. It's my understanding that she told someone it's too late. Is that your understanding?
I remember hearing that as well. And again, if you go back to the timeline, it kind of makes sense because even Joe DiMaggio, I believe, was with her driving her to Hemet at some point and never found him. He would never communicate with her. And then for some reason, something pivoted. He hears she's in the hospital. He goes to visit her. If it's November of 1954, it does make sense. Next thing you know, she's moving to New York City, 1955. She's in New York that entire year. She marries Arthur Miller in 1956. She starts living a life with Arthur Miller at that point, particularly in Roxbury and New York. She doesn't come back to LA until 61, really, to live. Then she buys her home in Brentwood and then, of course, passes away in August of 1962. There's not really anywhere else that fits in the timeline.
Right.
Because if she were going to Hemet to try to find him with Joe DiMaggio, why would she be doing that after he'd come to visit her?
Right. And actually, there's a letter to Grace from when she's a teenager. Grace was Gladys's best friend, who was Marilyn's guardian, Norma Jeane's guardian. She writes a letter to Grace when she's a teenager and married to her first husband and says, "Do you know how I can get in touch with Stan Gifford?" So as a teenager, she still very much wants to get in touch with him and is positive that Stan Gifford is her father.
So she knew.
Yeah.
She knew. Yeah. But it's nice that it's finally proven.
It's really nice. And I'm so glad that Stan Gifford's granddaughter has been willing to open herself up to this process. She provided her own DNA. She has been willing to talk about it with the producers of this documentary. And she talks about her grandfather and her father, who was Stan Gifford Jr. I don't think anyone could have predicted that we would get a DNA sample from Marilyn or a relative, because Marilyn had a sister and a niece through Gladys's side of the family, but that wouldn't prove who her father was. And I don't think anyone thought much about tracking the Giffords down. I'm so glad that someone finally tracked down a descendant of Stan Gifford.
Well, and found the hair. As you know, you had to have something from Marilyn in order to actually do the testing. Many people have, over the years, I've heard comment on, it was very disrespectful to pull Marilyn's hair from the trash. You know what's really interesting about that, though? There is a whole world of collectors collecting nothing but celebrity hair. It's not unusual.
It's not unusual. And I will say, in the Victorian era, having hair from your loved ones was very commonplace. And at one point, not seen as disrespectful at all. I think part of the problem with Alan Abbott is it was at an inopportune time. He dug it out of the trash after repairing her body from an autopsy. It's got that ick factor.
Right. Well, here's the question, and I'll pose this to our listeners. If you were in Alan Abbott's shoes, would you have pulled Marilyn Monroe's hair out of the trash can? Elisa, how about you?
I have actually thought about this over the years, and I've never been able to decide. I don't think I would have had the courage to do it. It is a treasured memento and a way to feel connected to someone. I just don't know if I had the courage to do it. That being said, I'm now glad that he did, because it answered this question.
That's my point.
What would you have done if you were there in 1962?
I would have done it.
Really?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And only for the reason of it's a once in a lifetime opportunity, recognizing full well it wouldn't have been just a memento. I can't really put it into words, but I think I agree with you that certain points throughout history, it's been very meaningful to have that piece of someone, their hair, as a memento of that person. And I think it would have been the same. But I think people need to kind of recognize, which sometimes I don't explain very well and can't explain, my relationship with Marilyn. And in my mind, it wouldn't have been her actual hair anyway. And we'll have to talk about that at some point, maybe in a different episode. But yeah, I would have, and would have recognized full well the importance. The difference between Alan Abbott and somebody like you and me is we're fans and we respect her.
Yeah.
I don't know why he pulled it out. So that really, to me, is the question. Why did you reach in and pull it out? What was your motivation? What was your incentive for doing that?
And I think that's why a lot of people have trouble with Alan Abbott, is because he didn't come across like, I was trying to preserve this because it was Marilyn Monroe. He just came across as creepy, pulling stuff out of the trash.
Right. Whereas somebody else that was a real fan of Marilyn, it would have been a way to really have something very, very special to them that they probably never would have parted with. I think that's kind of the difference there. We want to thank everybody for tuning in to this episode of All Things Marilyn. And you can bid on the card if you're interested at Julian's Auctions. The auction will be December 17th and 18th, Saturday and Sunday, and the card will be available. I put an estimate on the card of $2,000 to $3,000.
It's going to go above that.
I think it might go a little bit above that. I think it's going to go a lot above that. All right, everyone. It's been a pleasure for us to talk about this particular aspect of Marilyn's life for All Things Marilyn. We really appreciate you for tuning in and listening. If you have thoughts or ideas, suggestions, or feedback for us, or if you just want to email us and say hello, you can do so by reaching out to us via email at allthingsmarylandpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can just message us on Instagram. Our Instagram account is at All Things Maryland Podcast.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks everyone for tuning in for this episode, and we'll see you next time on All Things Maryland.
Good night, man.
Bye-bye.
You loved on the screen, and that's the one thing that survived, you know.
I realize more and more the responsibility, but you do miss sometimes just being able to be completely yourself and someplace and people just know you as another human being.